I'm going to teach you how to make beanies today. I made 4 beanies from one pattern, and they're all a little different. 2 of them were made out of sweaters, 1 out of a sweatshirt, and 1 I made out of a piece of fabric that I purchased. This tutorial is great because you're going to learn pattern making from measurements, you're going to learn some sewing tips and techniques, and you can make this pattern by hand using just hand stitching techniques, and I'm going to teach you a couple stitches, and you can do it on the machine. The first thing you're going to need is a couple of measurements. You want the first measurement to be around your head, over your ears. And then you want to write that number down. The next measurement you're going to want to take is over your head, over your ears. So from one earlobe to the other, over the top of your head. Okay, so I've got my numbers here. The circumference is 23.5, and I want to subtract 2 because I'm using a stretch material and I want to do something called a negative ease. And then I want to divide that number by 4. And so 23.5 divided by 2 is 21.5 divided by 4 equals 5.375. And because this is stretch material and it doesn't have to be perfect, I'm just going to call this number 5.5. I'm just going to round up to the nearest ½ inch. It's just a little bit easier. And the other number is 17 divided by 2, and that is 8.5. Right? So I'm going to go ahead just on this piece of paper and make my... So I can make my template on this piece of paper here. And I got myself a ruler. And what we need is a rectangle that is 8.5 inches tall. That's the overhead measurement divided by 2. And I'm just going to measure 8.5 inches up from the bottom here. And then I'm going to measure 5.5 over. And then I'm going to cut this out. Okay, I've got my template piece here. And we're going to do a strange little folding and drawing technique. This is just to get you that dome shape on the top. And this is a sort of squishy math way of finding that curve. And so the first thing we're going to do is fold it in half, taco style or hot dog style, as you might say. Okay, after you do that, open it up. And then you're going to fold another fold diagonally all the way across, lining this side up. So this top will be lined up with the side there. And try to get that as perfect as you can, just to make it nice and neat. It is stretch material, so it doesn't have to be exact, but I just want it to be nice. Open it up another time. And now we're going to do another diagonal fold, and we're going to just fold up against that middle line there. Now we've got 3 lines, and this is going to give us some marks. The first mark is just going to be this corner right here, at the bottom of this one. The next mark is you're going to mark here, and then you're going to go about 1/4 of the way from here to here. So if the halfway mark is here, you go 1/4 of the way here. It doesn't have to be exact. If it's over here, it's okay. If it's a little bit further in, it's fine. And then you've got this diagonal line here, and the first part you want to draw exactly along that line. And the reason you do this is because it's going to give you an angle that comes together at a 90-degree angle, and there's going to be 4 of them, and that'll make the top flat. And so we're going to go down about 1 inch before we start to curve. And we're going to curve down, hit this mark here, and then continue to curve down until we hit this mark down here. Now, if your curve looks a little bit different than mine, that's totally fine. It does not have to be perfect, because your head is not a perfect circle either. So this is just to round it out a little bit. Now we're going to fold it in half again and cut that line. And this is your template right here. So now I've got this piece of paper bag here, and I'm going to make sure that there's enough for 2 of these side by side plus an inch. So there should be 12.5 inches at least that direction. And I'm going to start up a little bit because we might want to leave a little room. And I'm going to leave about 1/2 inch over on the side, and I'm going to leave 3 or 4 inches below. And I'm going to draw my template. And then I'm going to put it next to itself here. I'm going to make sure this bottom line is straight using my ruler. There we go. And so I want to draw this as well. Now we've got our pattern drawn out on here, and I want to give it some seam allowance and enough for a brim. And so you can perfectly measure your seam allowance if you like, using your ruler to just kind of measure. And if you have one of those little sewing rulers with the little pinchers on it, that's what those are for. But you can do it with a regular ruler. But if you're like me, it doesn't really have to be perfect. Remember, we're working with stretch material here. So I'm just going to estimate on the rest of it 1/2 inch. You're welcome to measure the whole thing if you'd like. And then I'm going to measure 3 inches below there. It looks like we've already got 3 inches. So I'm just going to bring this down here. And this is for a hat with a brim. And now I'm going to cut this pattern out. Now you can absolutely just fold it if you want. And now we've got our pattern piece. Now there's a couple different ways to cut a pattern out of a piece of fabric. One is to use pins, and the other is to just draw it on. And I'm going to draw it. Now the one thing is, this ribbing pinches in, and I don't want it to do that, so I'm going to pull it out a little bit. And just to save fabric, in case we want to use this for anything, I'm going to move this over to the side. Now we could, this is at a curve, and so I can't do that with this one, but if this was a straight line or didn't have a seam at all, you could put the edge of this over and omit this seam allowance here and just cut it on the fold. But because there's a seam there, I'm going to have it over a little bit. And I'm going to have to put a seam on both sides of the hat. So I'm going to use this chalk roller to draw my line. You can also use a rotary cutter. Okay. Now I'm going to pin this together before I cut it, just so it doesn't shift around. I'm just going to put a few pins around the corners. And I'm going to cut out along that line. Now before you start sewing, if you want to, you can turn it out on the inside and on just one piece. You can turn it out around on the inside. This is the inside of the fabric. And you can tell by knit because the outside looks a little bit like stripes and the inside is a little bit more, and the inside is a little bit more nubbly. But if you want to give yourself a seam line, you can line your template up in here. And this is going to give you perfect lines. It's a little hard to draw on sweater fabric here. I'm going to sew my first couple of seams with needle and thread by hand, for those of you who don't have a sewing machine, and then I'm going to finish it off with a sewing machine. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold one piece in half, and this is really important. I'm going to go ahead and sew it from here, and then I'm going to follow that line down here. So we're going to kind of, that seam allowance is going to get smaller and smaller. And most importantly, you're going to start in the middle where this tip is. You don't want to start all the way over here. We're not sewing this because this is going to be a seam allowance for the next piece. So I'm going to start here, and I'm just going to back stitch it all the way down. And you want that back stitch to be fairly small and pretty tight so the knit doesn't come unraveled. Now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, now I've got both sides sewn up the sides here, and I've got two pieces. If you had a long enough piece, you might have it sewn together here and just have this already together. But because I've got two pieces instead of one long piece, we're going to fit these together. Now, I made this hat long enough to have a fold-up brim, which will look like this. And because I need to have the brim fold up, we're going to have to do something a little strange. We're going to sew normally right sides together like this. I'm going to start from the top. I'm going to pin it together to make sure it matches exactly. And I'm going to stop about an inch above where I want it to fold. But I'm actually going to cut a ½ inch in. We can measure it to be perfect. Inch up, maybe a little less than a ½ inch in, right there. And we're going to sew down to this point. And we're going to make that cut on both sides. And now I'm going to go over the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this down to here and this down to here. And we're going to leave it free. So we're not going to squish this over. We're just going to leave this open and start from the middle here and here. And again, you can do this by hand using a back stitch. So I sewed this with a sewing machine. We've got the side seams down to our little slits here. We've got these top seams here. I'm going to flip the hat outside right, like that. And now notice that these little sections flip out, like that. So I'm going to very carefully try and sew as close to that corner as I can and all the way to the bottom, and just make sure when you're sewing that these are exactly perfectly together. And we're just going to sew straight down here and straight down here. All right, I've sewn my little seams here, and we're going to check it. We might be able to just fold it up and call it done. It looks pretty good. If you wanted to, you can cut the corners of these seams in a little bit. Just cut the corner off. And that'll hide these seams. And now we have ourselves a little beanie. We've got this really long sweater here. And what I thought would be really cool is to show you another method of making this hat. We're going to use the same template, but we're going to double it this way. And the one thing I want to be careful of is, because this has a pattern on it, this has stripes, and we want to do something called pattern matching. I'm going to try and line everything up. You'll notice it's a little stretched out, so we've got to make sure the hat lines up on the stripes. We've got a black stripe at the bottom of this line, and this Should end at a stripe here. And now let's draw this out. And it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, so I'm going to use this stripe as the bottom of this part. I'm going to flip it over this direction, and we're going to double it, right? Like that. I just want to make sure that it's all lined up. All right. Now when I cut this out, I'm going to cut one piece out. I'm not going to cut both out because I want to make sure that that's perfectly lined up with the other side because I want to pattern match the edges. Okay, now I have to make this match the other piece as well as I can. You want to make sure that we actually turn it inside out because we're mirroring it. Because this fabric is stretchy, we kind of have to cheat it a little in places. And this would really help to pin it. All right, I've got it all pinned out. Make sure there's no other part of the sweater underneath there. And we're going to cut this out. We've got our two pieces together, and they're put together the same way they need to be sewn. And so we're going to sew this seam and this seam. And on one side, whichever we want to be on the inside, I think because this is kind of inconsistent with the stripes, I'm going to put this on the inside. So I'm going to put that little gap. I'm going to skip about 3 inches. And a good way to do that is to put some pins on it. I'd say right about here. We're going to leave this open. So we're going to sew here, here, and then all the way down on this side. But I'm going to go do that on the sewing machine. Okay, I've got the two sides sewn up. As you can see, there's a hole on this side. I've got the two sides sewn up with a hole on one side. And to put these together, I'm going to do it the same way I did before, kind of doing it backwards. We're going to lift these up and kind of kiss them together like this. So you've got your other seam in the middle. And then we're going to very carefully line up our stripes. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now remember when you're sewing to not go all the way to the edge, and that's how you have this seam allowance right here. So you want to make sure that that's there so you can open it out, and that way you'll get a little cross in the center. Okay, we'll match up the stripes on this side. So I'm going to go sew these two seams here and then do the same thing on the other side. I've sewn it all up except for the one little hole on the side. And we're going to flip it inside out using that hole. Right there. Now we're going to ladder stitch the hole together. Making sure to match my stripes again. Bury the thread inside of the hat. Now all you have to do is tuck one side of the hat into the other. So I've sewn the hole together with a ladder stitch, and now I'm going to fold one end into the other, like this. Straighten it out. And then we can either wear it as a slouchy hat, just as is, or we can roll it up and give yourself a little ear covering brim. To make one without a fold, we fold this part up. This was our fold up brim. And we cut out our pattern. I'm going to use a rotary cutter. I'm going to sew these two lines all the way down on both sides. I've got the two sides sewn. I'm going to open it out, and now I'm going to sew these seams. And I'm going to show you a little trick that applies to all darts that come down to a point when you're using a sewing machine. This is only for a sewing machine. And that is, I did not backstitch at the bottom of my dart unless I left. Instead, I left a tail, and I'm going to take that and tie it in a square knot, just overhand once, underhand once. And then when you snip it, leave about 1/4 of an inch. We'll do that on the other side as well. If we want, we can trim these corners so they don't stick out. Now let's flip this inside out, and we've got ourselves a cute little pink hat. So what do you do when you just have a piece of fabric? We're not using an old sweater, you're using a raw piece of fabric that I purchased. And you can use fleece, polar fleece, jersey, sweater net, any kind of fabric that's stretchy. This is a kind of thin, almost jersey weight sweater net. Because we don't have to worry about there being a seam on the side, we can just make one piece of fabric. So it's only going to have one side seam. And to do that, I'm going to fold up the seam allowance on one side, and I'm going to place that on the fold of the fabric. Now, there are two ways to do this. One is we won't have a brim to fold up, and if in that case, we still need a hem. And so I'm going to fold up 2 inches of this brim fold here, and so we'll just have 1 inch for the hem. If your fabric frays a lot or you want a really sturdy hem, leave 2 inches and just fold up part of it there. And the other way to do it is to leave this, if you do want to fold, and add a hem here, and add a hem to the bottom of your fold. And that will allow you to fold it up or to wear it like a slouchy hat. So I'm going to actually do it like that. I'm going to set my machine on zigzag, the widest it'll go. The length I'm going to set down to 2, and I'm going to set my tension down about halfway, so I'm just going to put it on a 5. I don't want the tension too tight because it'll buckle. If you noticed, I put my pins facing outwards, and that's so I can take them off as I sew. I'm going to line up the hole right here with the edge of my hem. And the one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to pull. We want to be very gentle. If your machine has a way to reduce the presser foot pressure, you want to reduce it fairly low. Because if you pull it, it'll stretch out and look weird. And we can flip it around. And we've got ourselves a hat. Now you'll be able to stay nice and warm this winter with as many hats as you want through this simple process. Have a great day and happy sewing.